Hey, my name's Lachlan Anchique. I'm just going to go through the case study presentation on Mike. So firstly, who's Mike? He's a 35-year-old male who's fairly physically active. He's just looking to improve his overall physical health. Obviously here, these gym sessions here aren't actually ones that were already in his schedule. So if you omit those, you see he's cycling 3 times a week. He's gardening, going food shopping, and he's also seeing his family every single day of the week. Which I could only imagine constitutes some sort of physical activity. So he's fairly physically active, but hardly an athlete, but he's also hardly sedentary as well. If we look at his goals sort of on a more qualitative basis, long term he's just looking for an overall health improvement. He's not thinking too hard about the results, the specific kilos of improvement, the specific VO2 max improvement. He just wants to improve his functionality, become more confident with strength training, and he wants to prove to himself as possible. He wants to prove that he can stick to a training program for a long time, and that he can reap some health benefits from that. And more short term, more looking at how we'll actually get there, it would involve a lot of giving him what he doesn't already have. So I'll go into this a little bit later in the more specifics, but just as an example, if you look at cycling, you're going to be in that rounded, hunched over position. If you look at his day-to-day work, assuming he's a sort of 9 to 5 office job, he's sitting down in that kyphotic sort of rolled over position, and so getting him out of those positions and giving him a bit more functionality by way of giving him what he doesn't already have and working away from his strengths will go a long way in improving his general health. One thing he mentioned as well was his worries of his knee joint pain. So that's another factor we'll play into, which I'll mention a little bit later when I go through the program. And it'll be very, very important to early doors make sure that the schedule, he's able to stick to it very well. So make sure that he's accountable to that, and that there's a lot of variety within the program so that he wants to keep coming back. And also making sure that the schedule that we make up for him works well around his current schedule, so that it isn't too cumbersome on him, and that it's nice and flexible around his week. And on that, we just want to make sure that it's sustainable, so he can do it for a long time. It's practical, and it's also real, so he can see the outcomes of the training, and he feels it and understands what his training means and does for him. If we look at his outcomes from his tests, we see that he's pre-hypertensive, so his systolic blood pressure of 129 puts him in that pre-hypertensive state. His BMI deems him as overweight. His waist to hip ratio of importance is below 0.9, which actually puts him at a reduced risk of metabolic syndrome, which is a positive. His cardiovascular fitness, his VO2 max is slightly above the average at the 65th percentile at 46 mils per kilo. His trunk flexibility is well below average at 12 centimeters. He's got a good level of bench press strength with a ratio of 1:1. He's got a very, very strong leg press, which will be one of those strengths that we don't look to actually hit. As well as this, he's got a very good level of abdominal strength, and he's having multi-stage sit-up test. So if we look at some of the research and how it relates to him, we can look at how much change we can expect over the course of this program. So his VO2 max of 46, that's it currently. And if we look at 2 main focuses of the program, on the left here we have what the effect of some of the HIIT training we do in sessions might have on him, and here we have the effect of his strength training. HIIT training has been shown to have a very potent stimulus for VO2 max improvement, with this study by Milanovic showing a 3.2 mils per kilo improvement in those with low baseline fitness. But importantly as well, is that the strength training itself, despite improving cycling joint efficiency, power, and time to exhaustion, especially cycling performance, it won't necessarily improve his VO2 max. So we can expect a little change in his VO2 max. His resting blood pressure will reduce slightly as a result of resistance training, with research by Kramer and colleagues showing that the resistance training is a method of slightly reducing systolic and diastolic blood pressure among a plethora of other methods. His leg press 3RM likely won't change very much. His training, as you'll see, is very specific to his leg press. It's not specific to leg press 3RM as well. It's very, very far away from that. So we expect little to no change. It wouldn't be anything significant, it wouldn't be anything important. And lastly, his bench press will change. We'll probably expect a small change, just going off a reference of this research by Johnson and colleagues, which found almost a 7 kilo improvement in moderately trained 21 to 28-year-olds with creatine supplementation. It's presumed that these people were going off these guys were going off a much higher volume. They were better trained, so their 1RMs were sitting around the 100 sort of range, and they're also being supplemented with creatine. So obviously they're going to get a much higher level of improvement. So we can expect a 3 to 5 kilo improvement in his bench press over the 4 weeks, if we're being sort of optimistic, I suppose. So in a general sense, before we go into the program, big parts of how his goals and outcomes will be achieved. First big one is variety. So reducing the risk of diminishing returns by making sure that we vary the training fairly regularly is going to be a really, really important part of his training, as well as promoting his adherence to the program itself. It has been shown that variety within a program does promote adherence, and your best ability is availability, I suppose, in that we want to make sure that he's coming to every single training session. We want to make sure he's not bored. We want to make sure that, obviously the training isn't injuring him, and that he can come back each week with a fresh fresh feeling of energy towards the session, because he knows it's not going to be exactly the same as last time, and he will be building upon himself every single session. And also making sure that he understands the health outcomes of the resistance training dominant sessions. We can see that reverse muscle loss, the reduced body fat, type 2 diabetes resistance, facilitating his physical function, blood pressure, and his bone mineral density is going to be a huge part of how this program affects him as a healthy human. So communicating that to him and making sure he understands the huge effect that resistance training will have is going to be an important part of this program. So more specifically, so how I'm going to break it up, I'm going to go through Monday. I'm going to go have a look at week 1 and week 3, because we're going in a 3-1 fashion. So comparing week 1 and 3 is probably the best way to go about it, because week 4 is far lower in intensity and volume. So we start here, we can see a posterior chain movement like the RDL, which is going to focus on the glutes and hamstrings. And so we looked at that leg press before, found that it was quite strong. So moving away from his strengths, giving him what he doesn't already have, that posterior chain strength, upper body pulling strength in this cable face pull up here, the complete opposite of those seated postures and cycling in his day-to-day life. We're really pulling him and opening him up. We'll just start to give him a little bit of what he doesn't already have to improve his general physical ability. He's got quite a bit of variety in here. So his C groups are his high intensity interval training. We see him going every single minute on the minute, using movements, carries, crawls, and jumps. We'll offer him a bit of variety, a bit of novelty, and we'll give him a sort of something fresh each session. And we'll give him that piece of variety that we did see that does drive adherence in the program. And just here we can see a bit of progression. So we see volume does improve does increase throughout the program. We see the intensities on the right here, they increase as well, just looking at his RARs and RPEs. And if we have a look at the tempos, compare those, we do see an addition of some tempos within the movements. And then having a look at his Thursday session, in week 1, once again, we see that posterior chain movement put first, just to make sure we're focusing on that, as well as his upper body pull put first. Those are our 2 main focuses. So his split squat, also another example, as well as the RDL, of how we're managing that knee joint pain, just putting 2 exercises that are fairly hip dominant. So obviously he's cycling a lot, and he's got a fairly strong leg press. So we want to be moving away from that, and starting to get him stronger in movements that he's not currently accumulating a lot of volume in. Once again, we've got pulling and reaching up eccentric, his 45-degree cowlex row. We've got a throw instead of a jump, a forward movement, and another carry. Once again, looking at improving volume throughout that, improving a bit of complexity in that reverse lunge just here, giving him what he doesn't already have in the pulls and variety. As far as healthy behaviour is concerned, quite simply, we're making sure that we're working around his schedule. None of these sessions interrupt with anything he already has going on, so he's going to be able to continue living the healthy lifestyle that he has. And lastly, just a few points of self-reflection. I found that this assignment was a really good opportunity to observe and assess research and how that actually affects individuals, and trying to predict outcomes as a result of training and as a result of how researcher looks into those specific modes of training was a pretty interesting challenge, as it is quite hard to predict outcomes, and usually people go off sort of their best guess. They look at the research, they go, okay, this tends to improve this, so we would assume that this will have an effect, but we don't go, this will have a 3 kilo effect or a 2 mil per kilo effect on VO2, for example. So that was a pretty unique sort of reflection looking back on this. It's something that I can sort of take into my own coaching. And here's just our references.